George Lucas provides new details about his original plan for the Star Wars sequel trilogy in Tashen's upcoming book, The Star Wars Archives. This is 1995 to 2005. This is from Polygon. And maybe the biggest reveal here is Lucas intended to resurrect the Phantom Menace villain himself, Darth Maul, and turn him into a main antagonist in the trilogy. Maul would appear with mechanical legs and become the godfather of crime in the universe, because as the Empire falls, he takes over. A direct quote from the book. People get really hesitant to comment about. I understand. Listen, the movies we got are the movies we got. They're going to be canon. But let's have some fun with this, guys, because going back to 2005, maybe even earlier, George Lucas is thinking about, how do I bring back Darth Maul? And of course, we got him in the Clone Wars, and we see his end in Rebels, which, when you think about this, think how drastically different the Star Wars story is if George Lucas does tell this sequel trilogy. It would have a massive ripple effect. Pete, when you learn this, is this the most shocking reveal, you think, when it comes to what George Lucas recently said and what we're going to find in this new book?
Well, I think, first of all, it's important to note that I don't know that it was recently said, but recently discovered, right? Because it certainly would have changed things, because Maul wouldn't have been able to be murdered by Obi-Wan in the desert, which I think is just such a fitting end to Maul, because what drives him is his desire for revenge on Obi-Wan. That said, I love that it's clear that Filoni and the story group have stayed close to what George said, whether they execute exactly what he had in his plans or not. The fact that Maul does return in Solo, which we were just talking about, as the crime lord that he is, it definitely pulls off of what George had in mind, and I would love to see that piece continue to be fleshed out. It's interesting too that he also was pulling Darth Talon out of that, which was a character that actually I think took place a couple thousand years before. I think it was early in the comic books, but interesting that he liked that character. And it's funny, and this is where Star Wars and the fandom and the mythology of the mythology is so interesting, because we've always heard that George hated Legends and Extended Universe, but he seemed to certainly enjoy Clone Wars enough to get behind Maul coming back, and liked Darth Talon enough to want to bring her into the story as well.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting that you bring that up, Pete. And I think that George Lucas himself even recognized the biggest mistake he made with the prequels was not making Maul a more central figure, killing him off too soon. And of course, George was ultimately part of Darth Maul back into the canon with the Clone Wars. So obviously he worked with Filoni. He had this idea in his head. We learn that he had, these treatments for the sequel trilogy that he put on the bookshelf because he looked at it as a decade commitment to tell a new sequel, and he wanted to raise his daughter, which I think is poetic in itself. He makes these movies for kids and for fans to grow up with and to, go on that hero's journey with. Well, he's taking a break so that way he can go raise his own kid. I think that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Arezou, I would like to ask you about this, the fact that George, in this book, and like Pete said, not recently said, but recently uncovered for this new book, Leia was going to be identified as the chosen one in the sequel trilogy. If George Lucas makes the sequel trilogy in like 2012, 13, 14, whenever, Leia was ultimately going to be the chosen one. And not necessarily what happened here in the sequel trilogy we have, but she's definitely a central figure. How do you interpret that? You kind of see like those two stories mirrored?
So you guys know I only like the first two movies of the sequel trilogy, but one thing I will say overall that I like about those two movies is that the focus is on the new generation, and that Leia plays her part, because like I love Leia. Leia is, the heart and soul of the rebellion. So that she plays that figure as like the chosen one for the rebellion, and not so much the Jedi side, because I think that's what you meant, but that she is sort of that chosen one. So I think in that respect, it's nicely mirrored without putting the entire bulk of the focus of the movie on Luke and Leia. I like that the new focus of the movies we have is the next generation.
See, and I think that's such a great take because I'm one of those people that I wish this trilogy would have been a little bit more focused on the original 3 because it's so rare a franchise gets the opportunity to come back to the table in 40 years and still have the 3 main leads living and can tell that story. But, I don't think that's what the conversation is. I mean, I think for me, though, I'm satisfied because it's like, oh, well, George would have told a story that might have been a little bit more focused on those original 3 for maybe a little bit longer. Maybe they would have been together at least for one frame in episode 7. I do think it's interesting, going back to a point that Pete had, Maul being the villain to me, like I think it's cool and that could have been really epic, but I prefer the story that we got in Clone Wars and Rebels, especially because Darth Maul coming back from the dead is just too small for that sequel trilogy. Like I'm kind of disappointed to see from at least the information that we have so far is that Plagueis wasn't going to be the ultimate baddie, because I still stand by Darth Plagueis. The villain, the baddie for the culmination in 7, 8, and 9 is there in that opera scene in Revenge of the Sith when they're sitting there watching the Mon Calamari dancers. And have you ever heard this tale of Darth Plagueis the Wise? That is the story. That is the baddie. And that said, there's some things that I really do love about the sequel trilogy. I think some of it's great fun. Some of it doesn't work for me. But in my head, I really do wish that Plagueis would have been revealed as the baddie, because then for once I really would be, well, I would rather have that, than like, we got the Colin Trevorrow script and I was like, got some good things, but I'm at peace as a Star Wars fan. I think I'm buying this book though. Are you guys maybe interested in picking this up, or is there something we haven't discussed in this that you think we should talk about?
I want it, but it's $300 here. So
it's $300 in Canada.
Yeah, with the exchange, it's almost $300 here. So I probably gonna sit this one out. But if somebody would like to lend me their copy, I want to read it.
You know what? Right now it's $150 for those people in the US. And so I do want to let everybody know that again, the Star Wars Archives 1999 to 2005 will be available in the US starting December 13th. The book is already rolling out in the UK. You can visit Taschen homepage to order the book, or you can head over to Polygon's website for more highlights from that book. So definitely check that out. And we want to know what you think about this new information. Do you like these ideas that George Lucas had for a sequel trilogy? Yeah, we've already talked about the wills. He was going to do the will stuff. It was going to be really deep into how the Force worked, but he was going to make Maul the bad guy in 7, 8, and 9. That would have been a trip.
I think that the last thing I'll add to this, David, is that I am a big fan of the what ifs, but not at the expense of what we got, right? So whether we look, Arezou and I are in a similar camp about Rise of Skywalker, but that's the story we have. So that's what we're living with, and that's what we're doing. That's Star Wars now, and for better or worse. And Last Jedi, not everybody loved that, but that's Star Wars now, for better or worse. And the last thing that I'll say is, when Mike Chen was on my show a couple weeks ago, he had this really unique point of view on what would make and how he kind of in a way views the sequels. Mike Chen wrote a story in The Empire Strikes Back from a certain point of view. And that is, if you don't look at them as 7, 8, and 9, if you look at them as a continuation of the story and some of your old friends show up, you can digest the story a little bit differently. And ever since he said that, I've looked at the sequels a little bit differently. I wouldn't go so far as to say what some people say is it's not canon or that it's fan fiction, but I will go so far as to say it's a continuation of the story, just not necessarily 1 through 6.
Thank you for watching Beyond the Blast Doors. Be sure to subscribe to our channel. Don't forget, give us a thumbs up and leave a comment. Beyond the Blast Doors, a Star Wars conversation.